The figures sitting in your bank account aren't physically there. Here is the uncomfortable truth. The system cannot afford for you to be debt-free. You are both the fuel and the collateral. The figures sitting in your bank account aren't physically there. This isn't a figure of speech, and it certainly isn't a conspiracy theory. If every single depositor decided to walk into their branch tomorrow and withdraw their cash, the entire system would collapse within hours, simply because the money does not exist. This is not an error or a glitch in the software. It is the deliberate architecture of the global financial system, a trick so ancient and so deeply embedded that we have accepted it as reality. It is known as fractional reserve banking, and it is the silent engine driving global debt, inflation, and the mirage of wealth. Once you understand its mechanics, you will realize that money itself is built on promises that can never truly be fulfilled. To grasp the origins of this system, we must travel back to a time before our world ran on digital numbers. In medieval Europe, money was physical, gold and silver. If you were rich, you possessed coins in a chest or jewels to trade. However, transporting heavy bags of gold was risky. So, people started leaving their valuables with goldsmiths, men who owned secure vaults. In return, the goldsmith would issue a receipt, a simple paper note promising that the holder could return and collect their gold. Soon, people realized they could trade these paper receipts instead of the heavy gold itself. After all, the note represented the value just as well, and it was much easier to carry. This is where the trick was born. The goldsmiths noticed a pattern. Almost nobody came to claim their physical gold at the same time. So the goldsmiths got creative. They started issuing more receipts than the gold they actually held. It was, effectively, money conjured out of thin air. This wasn't just a clever side business, it was revolutionary. By the 17th century, governments themselves adopted it. The Bank of England was established in 1694, not to serve the people, but to solve a crisis. The crown was drowning in debt from perpetual wars. The bank lent money to the government, far more than it held in reserves in exchange for interest payments. This debt was repaid not with treasure from conquests, but with the taxes of ordinary citizens. The United States followed this same path. Early American banks issued banknotes redeemable in gold, but they too quickly realized they could print far more notes than they had metal to back them. Periodic bank runs exposed the lie. Crowds of panicked depositors demanding their money, only to find the vaults empty. Entire banks collapsed overnight. Yet, instead of ending the system, governments doubled down. They created central banks to backstop the illusion, sending a clear message. Even if the money isn't there, we will ensure the public keeps believing it is. Now, let's translate this into modern terms. Imagine you deposit $100 into a bank. In reality, the bank is only required to keep a tiny fraction of it in reserve. Historically, that fraction might have been 10%. By the time the cycle ends, your original $100 has multiplied into nearly $1,000 circulating in the economy. But here is the catch. Only the first $10 actually exists as cash. The rest is pure debt. Every new dollar in the system is born as someone's obligation to pay it back with interest. If that was shocking, I have worse news. What I just described is actually the old way. In the United States today, reserve requirements are not 10%. They are 0. Since March 2020, the Federal Reserve has required banks to hold absolutely nothing against the deposits they take. That means the textbook multiplier doesn't strictly control how banks lend anymore. So if banks don't need reserves, what stops them from lending infinity? The leash today isn't reserve requirements. It is capital and liquidity rules, established under a global framework known as Basel. These rules were crafted after a series of crises by a group of central bankers and regulators who meet in Basel, Switzerland, at the Bank for International Settlements, the so-called Central Bank of Central Banks. These rules aren't written by elected officials, but by unelected technocrats. If a bank wants to make a risky loan, it may be required to hold shareholder equity as a buffer. These rules are supposed to prevent banks from flying too close to the sun. But notice the shift. Banks don't lend from deposits anymore. They create loans first, which in turn create deposits. When you sign a mortgage, the bank doesn't take cash from a vault. It simply types new digits into your account. That new money exists solely because you agreed to pay it back. That is why, in the modern system, more than 90% of the money in circulation is not central bank money, but bank money, created out of thin air the moment a loan is issued. This design creates three unavoidable consequences. First, inflation. Because banks keep multiplying the same dollars into more and more credit, the value of each currency unit erodes. Second, perpetual debt. Since money enters existence as a loan, there is always more debt in the system than there is money to repay it. Third, the concentration of power. Banks collect interest on money they never truly possessed. Governments use this system to finance wars, welfare, and bailouts without directly raising taxes. When this machine hiccups, the illusion cracks. Look at the Great Depression. In 1929, banks had loaned wildly beyond their reserves, fueling a stock market bubble. When panic struck, depositors rushed to withdraw, but the money wasn't there. The same happened in 2008. Banks had multiplied credit through mortgage-backed securities. When defaults spread, the system nearly imploded, and once again, governments and central banks intervened, pumping trillions into the system to keep the illusion alive. And this is where the global context matters. In the US, reserves are gone. In Europe, the UK, Canada, and Australia, reserve requirements had already become symbolic or non-existent. They all rely on Basel Rules now. Meanwhile, in emerging economies like China, India, and Brazil, reserve requirements still exist. But even there, Basel Capital Rules sit on top, dictating how much risk banks can officially take. No matter where you live, the leash on money creation isn't deposits in a vault. It is regulations written in Switzerland. Here is the uncomfortable truth. The system cannot afford for you to be debt-free. If every household paid off their loans tomorrow, the money supply would collapse. Banks would have nothing to lend. Economies would grind to a halt. The illusion depends on your participation, your willingness to borrow, spend, and believe the digits in your account represent something real. You are both the fuel and the collateral. So what should you take from this? First, that money is not wealth. Real wealth is not digits on a screen. It is land, resources, skills, knowledge, and independence. It is assets that hold value when paper promises dissolve. Building real wealth, things that survive outside the cycle of inflation and debt, is the only path to freedom. The lesson isn't paranoia. It's awareness. If your money is born as someone else's debt, then your freedom depends on stepping outside that machine. History doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme. Every major financial crisis is a reminder that the system's stability rests not on gold or productivity, but on confidence. And confidence is the easiest thing to lose. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers, and I'll show you where to look.